Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, that's The Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and economic freedom in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, this week, do corporations prefer the marketplace or a large and powerful government? Well, a recent letter in the Wichita Eagle criticized the marketplace and the power that corporations purportedly hold over it. The letter was in response to an op-ed by Charles Koch about how he and Bernie Sanders agree on a few issues. Not everything, mind you, just a few issues. Well, the letter writer stated, "It was also no surprise to read that his solution is a very small and weak government." Now, I very carefully read the Charles Koch op-ed to which the letter writer referred, and I did not see a call for weak government. I believe the letter writer is confusing a small and weak government with limited government. Generally, libertarians favor a limited government that is strong in protecting our safety, our rights, and our liberties, but limits itself to exercising the enumerated powers outlined in the Constitution. A limited government is very different from a weak government. A weak government could be very large in terms of the taxes and resources it consumes, but at the same time be weak because it has trouble protecting the national defense and protecting the rights and liberties of its citizens. David Bose of the Cato Institute summed it up. He wrote, "Libertarians support limited constitutional government. Limited not just in size, but of far greater importance, limited in the scope of its powers." He also tells how he once read this, "Smokey Bear's rules for fire safety also apply to government. Keep it small, keep it in a confined area, and keep an eye on it." And in his own words, Bose describes the essence of libertarianism as don't hit other people, don't take their stuff, and keep her promises. Well, back to the letter in the Wichita Eagle. The writer wrote, "The very, very rich people and corporations do not check themselves. The marketplace system they embrace as the sole solution encourages the accumulation of more and more wealth and power, and using that power to accumulate more wealth." Well, here I think the letter writer is just simply uninformed. Because with a few exceptions, corporations do not embrace the marketplace, if by marketplace the writer means a system of free markets. Instead, as Charles Koch correctly notes, most corporations seek to constrain and limit the power of free markets. Milton Friedman diagnosed the situation correctly when he wrote, "The great virtue of free enterprise is that it forces existing businesses to meet the test of the market continuously, to produce products that meet consumer demands at lowest cost, or else be driven from the market. It is a profit and loss system." Naturally, Friedman wrote, "Existing businesses generally prefer to keep out competitors in other ways. That is why the business community, despite its rhetoric, has so often been a major enemy of truly free enterprise." Well, yes, it's difficult to do the things that Friedman says businesses must do in a market economy. Innovate, be customer-focused, and be efficient. It's far easier to hire lobbyists at the federal, state, and local levels to gain an advantage over your competitors. The harm of that system of cronyism is explained by Charles Koch when he wrote, "Perversely, this regulatory burden falls hardest on small companies, innovators, and the poor, while benefiting many large companies like ours," referring to Koch Industries. He continued, "This unfairly benefits established firms and penalizes new entrants, contributing to a two-tiered society." Yes, it is government, not markets, that are creating two tiers of society. As an example, consider the barriers government erects for certain occupations. In recent episodes, I've told you how the city of Wichita is about to make it much more difficult and costly to become a massage therapist. That blocks a path to upward mobility. Minimum wage laws make it more difficult for young people and unskilled workers to find a job, and that's another obstacle in the path to upwards mobility. And right now, the city of Wichita, I believe, is considering new regulations regarding food trucks. Undoubtedly, these regulations will make it more difficult and costly to start a food truck, creating yet another barrier when people want to start a business. And the letter writer to the Eagle talked about the accumulation of power. Well, in markets, free markets, it is the consumer that has power, at least if markets are free from excessive government meddling. If consumers do not like what is offered to them, entrepreneurs generally sense that and rush in to fulfill a need. And if these entrepreneurs are successful in giving customers what they actually want, well, they can become fabulously wealthy. That wealth comes from the power of consumers to choose. And as Friedman explained, many existing business firms do not like that power and seek to limit it through government. Well, back again to the Wichita Eagle letter. Another complaint of the writer is that the rich fund the multitude of foundations and university professors that pitch their philosophy attacking public schools and other public services. Well, some rich people do, and thank goodness for them. If not for the generosity of Charles and David Koch and a few others in founding organizations like the Cato Institute, there might be few sources of information besides a self-serving government or those who benefit from an expansive meddling government. The latter being the corporations that the letter writer complains use the marketplace to gain more wealth and power, but in reality are using government to enrich themselves. An example of self-serving government providing information is the city of Wichita. Recently, the city produced a video that served as an annual State of the City address. Now, did this video include any of the important but unfortunate news from last year? Well, the answer is no, it did not. Even good news, such as learning that we can provide drought protection for many millions of dollars less than what the city first told us, well, that news didn't make the video. And even a plain and simple reporting of city news is sometimes difficult or impossible. Do you remember the special election in February 2012 when city voters overturned an ordinance that the council had passed? Well, the city's news release page had no mention of the results of that election. The city did, however, report on Valentine's Day at Mid-Continent Airport, rain garden workshops in February, and firefighter receives puppy rescued at fire scene. Well, who can turn away from a rescued puppy story? But the city needs to acknowledge and report the important news. As far as funding university professors, this serves as a useful and valuable check to the multitude of taxpayer-funded public university professors who indoctrinate and condition students to embrace more government. Shouldn't college students be exposed to a variety of views? Yeah, but that doesn't seem what students are receiving. Here's what the journal Higher Insight Ed reported a few years ago. It said academics, on average, lean to the left. A survey being released today suggests that they are moving even more in that direction. Among full-time faculty members at four-year colleges and universities, the percentage identifying as far left or liberal has increased notably in the last 3 years, while the percentage identifying in 3 other political categories has declined. And recently I was invited to debate a political science professor who works at a public university. And he said that as long as the United States controls its currency, the national debt is not a problem. We can simply create as much more money as we need, he said. We ought to be spending more on things like Social Security, he said. The reasoning being that we can just print up as many $100 bills as we need to pay the benefits. Well, thank goodness that someone funds university professors and think tanks to counter blatant nonsense like this. But I'm concerned that the letter writer we've been talking about is emblematic of the knowledge and attitudes of many people. That's what worries me. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Well, I'm also concerned about what has been happening in our state government. And there are two developments that really concern me and should also concern you. One issue is the economic details of a semi-secret sale of bonds by the state of Kansas, which are worse than what's been reported. What happened last year is the Kansas Department of Transportation issued $400 million in long-term bonds and pretty much under the radar, out of the public eye. Here's what Professor Edward Flinchey explained in the Wichita Eagle. He wrote, "Right-wing Republican lawmakers have operated under the radar to suspend all statutory limits on highway debt, and that unprecedented authority was recently used to issue record-breaking levels of long-term debt to pay for their reckless income tax this year and the next. 6 lines buried deep in a 700-page appropriation bill last spring gave the Kansas Department of Transportation unlimited authority to issue debt, and in early December, without public disclosure, the agency used that authority to issue $400 million in highway bonds." That was Dr. Ed Flinchey in the Wichita Eagle. Well, a few notes. First of all, as we've said before, tax cuts do not need to be paid for. Tax cuts simply mean that the people are allowed to keep more of what is rightfully theirs in the first place. And that is a good thing. It is government that must be paid for, not tax cuts. Then, the Secretary of Transportation has in the past been given broad, maybe not unlimited, but broad authority to issue bonds and borrow money. A law passed in 2010 gave the Secretary power to issue bonds up to a certain limit. And you may remember that in 2010, Kansas had a Democrat for a governor, which should caution us not to make this issue too political. As far as borrowing from the Bank of KDOT, you've probably heard that expression, it's been done before and under governors of both parties, and payments on these loans had been deferred or not made again under both governors of both parties. So instead of politicizing this issue, let's concentrate on the facts and merits. And when we look at the Series 2015B bonds, the bonds that were sold under the radar, so to speak, there is plenty to criticize. First, the state will not pay any principal on these bonds until 2026, that is, for 10 years. Until then, the state will pay only the interest on the $400 million, which is $20 million per year. Then, starting in 2026, the state will make 11 annual payments of various amounts toward the principal. In all, the schedule from KDOT shows the state will pay about $282 million in interest on a loan of $400 million. Well, I don't think that most Kansans would appreciate the state borrowing so much money for such a long time without making any effort at retiring the principal. But again, before we politicize, bonds sold in September 2010 do not require principal payments until 2032, and there have been other such interest-only bond sales. Well, there's even more to criticize about the December 2015 bonds. The actual proceeds the state will receive from the bonds is $488 million. So how, you may be asking, can the state issue $400 million in bonds but receive $488 million when it sells them? Well, the answer is what's called an original issue premium of about $89 million. Well, to explain how that works, bonds similar to these that were sold in 2015 ought to yield in the range of 2% to maybe 2.75% interest. But the state of Kansas is paying 5% interest on these bonds. Therefore, bond buyers are willing to pay more than the face value, that's the $400 million, for these bonds, because they will be earning higher than market interest. In fact, these bonds are sold at premiums ranging from 119 to 126%, meaning for that every $1 worth of bonds bought, representing money the state must repay, the state actually received from $1.19 to $1.26. Now, wait a minute. You may be thinking that sounds like a pretty good deal for the state. But in exchange for this premium, the state pays much higher interest. In this case, the state is paying 5% interest instead of perhaps 2.5% interest. There are several different ways of looking at this, but the upshot is that the state is receiving additional money now in exchange for paying a higher interest rate for many years, about $89 million in extra interest, which increases the actual cost of these bonds beyond what we thought. And again, before we politicize, the state, under a Democratic governor, has done the same. Well, the allure of borrowing large sums and spending them now is not limited to transportation bonds. The state is currently using the recent $1 billion in proceeds from KPERS bonds as a rationale to skip KPERS contributions this year and also suspend a rule that most proceeds from the sale of surplus property must go to KPERS. And the legislature is also considering a bill that will allow Governor Sam Brownback to defer making payments to KPERS, the state's defined benefit pension plan for public employees. These deferred payments would have to be made up in future years, although there is really no mechanism to enforce this. That unfunded liability of KPERS is a big problem. It refers to the difference between what KPERS expects to pay compared to the revenue it expects to receive. In recent years, the Kansas Pension Fund has been among the worst in the country based upon the funding ratio, although it's doing a bit better now. Well, like I said, last year the state issued $1 billion in bonds to address a portion of the unfunded liability. Now, while this helps KPERS, it simply means that the state owes another $1 billion on a different balance sheet. But it's the same taxpayers that will eventually pay. Barry Paulson, emeritus professor at the University of Colorado, has written on the danger of borrowing to shore up state pension funds, as Kansas has done. He explains there is the lack of nexus between the investment of the bond proceeds and payments for unfunded liabilities in the plan. He further explained, if legislators see that additional funds are available to pay off unfunded liabilities in the pension plan, well, they may choose to allocate less general fund money to meet these pension obligations. That is exactly what is happening in Kansas. The borrowing of $1 billion last year has let legislators and the governor feel that there is breathing room, and that the state can slack off making the KPERS contributions it should be making this year and every year. This means that the borrowed funds may be used for current spending rather than correcting the KPERS unfunded liability. This is highly unresponsible and reckless. Both of these episodes, the highway bonds, the deferral of KPERS payments because of the borrowing for KPERS, both of these episodes are very troubling. But it is almost impossible to discuss these issues without political passions getting in the way. Liberals and moderates in Kansas say it is bad for the state to rack up debt to pay for current spending, but at the same time they are happy to ignore that behavior under President Obama. They also don't want spending cuts. And conservatives, as we see, have sought to borrow rather than reforming and cutting spending to match the new tax rates they passed, even after they raised sales tax in a way that is harmful to our state's lowest income households. This is all quite a mess, and I really don't know how we will escape it. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. In Kansas, progress in education reform has not happened this year. Even the most gentle moves towards more school choice aren't happening. In December, Senate President Susan Wagle told the Wichita Pachyderm Club she believed there would be a charter school bill this year, a bill that would expand the possibility of having more charter schools. But I haven't seen that bill. And an attempt to let teachers vote every 3 years on whether they are satisfied with their current union representation is facing fierce resistance from entrenched interests, that is, our state's teachers union. Last week on this show, we saw a video of just how harmful the teachers unions are to students. And the Coalition of Innovative Districts, which was an effort to allow a few school districts to escape some of the state's education bureaucracy, well, it hasn't seemed to produce results or much enthusiasm either. Reform in education just is not happening in Kansas. Instead of working towards reform that will help students, the fight is mostly over spending. And the schools are pretty good at making their case for more spending. In response to real or potential cutbacks, the Wichita School District has released a list of possible responses. At the top of the list is cutting back on bus transportation, raising the possibility of first graders having to walk 2.5 miles to school, crossing busy streets, freeways, and railroad tracks to get to school and back home each day. This is a version of the Washington Monument strategy. That's where government proposes highly visible actions as a way to get more funding, such as shutting down the Washington Monument. Here, the Wichita School District uses transportation cuts in the same way. It's a cynical strategy, and it often works. We really need education reform in Kansas, but we are not getting it. Here's a video from Learn Liberty that explains how schools can innovate if government only gets out of the way.
Choice in schools is good and will improve the existing system. But what we really need is choice in education, which is much, much more than that. You may not realize this, but we're currently living through a revolution in education. We're seeing a revolution, a complete transformation in the way education is carried out and delivered, both here in the United States and also worldwide. Most people, when they think of education, think of schools. What we are seeing now is a move away from the traditional school as a way of delivering education. In many of the poorest parts of the world, the great majority of children of school-going age attend private institutions which are much more flexible than the traditional school, which don't conform to the traditional ideas of what a school is. In Brazil, for example, almost 70% of children of school-going age attend institutions of this kind. In the United States, the homeschooling movement has turned into a major social movement in which all kinds of educational forms are developing. Parents' cooperatives, learning centres, independent learning providers of all kinds, delivering education in a much more flexible, home-centred, but no longer totally home-based way. Where has all this come from? Well, there are two main sources. One, obviously, is technology. The advent of the internet has made all kinds of educational innovation and provision much more possible than was the case before. The other, though, and the main reason, is that what we have here is a social transformation. All kinds of people, both parents and pupils, are voluntarily cooperating together to provide an education that they control, one that reflects their goals and desires rather than those of governments, large firms, or political movements of one kind and another. So where is all this going? Well, what we're seeing is something very exciting, a radical transformation of the way education is delivered. We're moving into a new world in which people will be educated in quite a different way, and above all, a world in which people will control and direct their own education in a way which they have not done for over 200 years now. And this can only be an enormous change for the better.